Hello, Internet! In this video, we're going to cover the world's most simple design pattern ever. It's called the Singleton, and we're going to go through it and then go through a few little examples of it, and hopefully you'll understand it by the end of it. So, firstly, what is a singleton? A singleton is basically an object which allows you to only create a single instance of that object. So for the whole application, there will only be one object that is ever created if it's a singleton. So let's look at an example now. So if I create a new little package over here, just call it model. What we'll do is we'll call this, say, data provider. Yes, I'll do that. Right, so one of the reasons that you might use a singleton is that you want to share state across different places in your application. A common place you'll see this is in Android programming, where you're sharing state across different activities. Now, in order for us to make this work, all we need to do is create a class that's got some state that's not final. So, for example, you do something like this, which make it a string. I should also point out I'm using something called Lombok. So this dependency here, Lombok, is something you're going to want to have, because I'm going to be, instead of like writing a constructor myself, I will do things like this. No args constructor, and then we also want a getter and a setter on this particular class. So basically what we can do with this class, at the moment, all we have is a no-args constructor, a getter, and a setter. But we need some other stuff to make this a singleton, as it is. So what do we need? Well, we need a static method that returns an instance of the class. So we'll do public static data provider. And typically, a singleton, the method to get the instance will just be called getInstance. You don't have to do that. That's just typically what will be in the UML diagrams if you've ever seen this pattern before. And what we want to do is we want to check if the instance we already have is present. So for that, we actually need a private static data provider. In this case, it will just be called data provider. So we want to check if this is null. Okay, so if objects is null, data provider. If it's null, then we want to create a new one. So data provider equals new data provider. So we're using that no-args constructor that I've used up here to create a new instance. So when someone calls this method, it's first going to check if this particular class here has a non-null method. If it does, if it is null, it's going to create a new one. If not, and after it's been created, it will simply just return the data provider. So first time this gets called, this bit of code will get executed. There will be a new data provider created, and then it will return that instance. The second time it's called, this bit of code won't get actually invoked. Instead, we'll just return the existing data provider. So we have one instance of this data provider. Note that the idea is that we're not supposed to be using this constructor outside of this class. Okay, so we could actually make it private, but I'm not going to bother. So we've now created this, so let's have a look at what we can do. I'm just going to come to the main class here and we'll print out some stuff. So first thing we need to do is say final data provider, and then we'll just say data provider, and then this will be not new data provider, but it will just be data provider dot get instance. Okay. So this is going to go through this code here. It's going to create a new data provider and then return us that single data provider. What I then want to do is do something like this: data provider set state, and we'll say something like, I don't know, pip pow. Then what we want to do is see what that state looks like. So we can do data provider get state. Okay, and we'll say data provider. Okay, the next thing we should do is create a second instance of this class. So we'll do something like data provider 2, and here this will be 2, and here this will be 2 as well. Okay, so what's going to happen is we're going to run this application. This is going to create a data provider. We're going to set the state to pip-pip-pow. We're going to print the state of the data provider, the first one we've created, and that should be pip-pip-pow. We'll get another instance of the data provider, and we will get the state from this one. No, we haven't set the state for this data provider 2, and it should print out pip-pip-pow because we have a single instance, despite the fact that we have 2 references to that instance. So if I go ahead and run that, it's going to do some running, and we'll see down here it has printed out pip-pip-pow, and then data provider 2 has also printed out pip-pip-pow. What we can also do is we can then, let's say, do data provider 2 set state, and then go something like give me all your honey. Don't know where that came from. And then I can print out data provider 2 state and data provider 1 state, and we should find that now both of them have changed their state, despite the fact that we've only set the state on one of the data providers. And you can see that's the case. So down here we've got this thing that's now been set. So this is a good way of sharing things across classes if you wanted to. Now this is the simplest way of doing a singleton. If you're using Spring Boot, what I'm using at the moment, then by default, when you create something that's annotated with service or bean or repository, or what are the other ones? Can't think of any at the moment. Oh, component. There are a few other things like that. If you annotate it with one of those annotations, Spring will actually create the class for you as a singleton by default. And so if we have a look at this, what we're going to do is we'll turn this data provider into a Spring singleton. So I will make this, for lack of a, we'll just call it a repository. It's not actually a repository, but whatever. So we'll create this as a repository. And what we're going to do is we are going to get rid of that and get rid of all that. The reason we can get rid of all that is because we still have the getter and we still have the setter on the state. We still have a no-else constructor, which Spring's going to use to actually instantiate this the first time. And we don't need to check anything about any of the instances because Spring is going to handle the object creation for us. So now if I just create a new class and we'll call it, I don't know, example. And example will make this a service just so that Spring creates it when we load the application up. And we'll give this an all-args constructor, and we'll say that this will have private final data provider. It will have a data provider like this. And just to make things simple, we're going to create a post constructor just so we can print stuff out. And in this post constructor, we are going to actually in this one, let's not do the post constructor here. Let's create a data provider in here, and in this I want to expose the setter, so and the getter actually. So for example, we'll do public void set state final string string or state, and then just do data provider set state state, and then do public void get state, and we'll do return data provider get state, and of course that shouldn't be void, that should be string. I'm a buffoon. Okay, so now we've got this thing here which has a data provider in it. It's a class that contains a data provider. I'm going to now create something where we can just print stuff out using Spring context. So if we do Would you call it printer? Yes, stop asking me. We'll make this an all args constructor as well, and we'll make the printer component for whatever reason, doesn't really matter. And in here, private final, I will say we need, what's the thing we need? What did we just create? So I want the example, but I also want the data provider. Okay. And if I now create a post constructor, what I'm going to do is we're going to do something like this. We'll say data provider, what the hell? Data provider, set state, wow. And then we'll do system out, print line, data provider, and then do data provider get state. And of course we want to do the same thing for the example. Like that. And of course let's try again with the example. Do example set state and do if we do that. Okay, so what's going to happen now if I remove all this crap, because that won't work. The Spring Boot application is going to start up. It's going to create 3 separate what are called Spring Beans. These are all going to be singletons by default. It's going to create a printer, an example, and it's going to create a data provider. When the printer is created and the post construct happens, it's going to set the state for the data provider to wow, 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 wow. Then we're going to print that, and then we're going to also set the example state to from example, and then hopefully both of them will have changed to from example, and then the first time the example one will also be wow, 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 wow. So if I run that now, it's going to start compiling, it's going to run, and here we go. You can see that this is now printed out. So data provider, wow, 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 wow. Example, wow, 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 wow. Data provider from example, and then example from example. So that's how the singleton pattern looks when you're using Spring Boot. And so hopefully now you understand the singleton pattern. You know how to create your own implementation of a singleton pattern. This is what we did at the start. And you've also seen an example of where it's used in an actual framework. So in the case of Spring Boot, we're using singletons all the time by default when we use things like component annotations, service annotations, repository annotations, and so on and so forth. So hopefully that's been useful. Arrivederci, guten tag, konnichiwa, bonjour, ta-ta.